Aquinas today, Tradition and Innovation, to be given by our most distinguished lecturer, Father Bernard Lonergan. Dr. Wesolowski from the Department of Theological Studies will introduce Father Bernard Lonergan to you.
Good evening. In brief and bold strokes, a minimum may be permitted by way of an introduction. This evening we are honored to have with us a person who has struggled with and rethought many of the fathers of the Church, as witnessed in his works on the Trinity and on the Incarnation, and therefore has also given us new ways to consider the history of Christian doctrine, both in its achievements and in its limits. A person who has struggled with and rethought the works of Aquinas, as witnessed in, among other places, his works Gratia Operans and Verbum, Word and Idea in Aquinas. A person who has struggled with and rethought the fundamental, dynamic, and structural elements of cognitional theory in mathematics, in the natural sciences, and in the human sciences, as this is presented in his monumental work, Insight, a Study of Human Understanding. And in this way, he has also given us new ways to consider the philosophical tradition, as well as such thinkers as Kant, Hegel, Marischal, and other philosophers who have used the transcendental method. And finally, because of his further inquiries into the nature and history of historical consciousness, and because of the need to indicate and develop ways of collaborative and methodological inquiry, it might be noted that the first aspect can be seen in the critical studies and critiques that have come out of the First International Lonergan Congress, which was held in Florida in 1970, and the second aspect in Father Lonergan's recent work, Method in Theology. If there is one thing that thinking requires, whether philosophical or theological, it is that man reconceive the world and himself. And on this theme, it seems, there is a very clear insistence and creative contribution by Father Lonergan in his analysis of the dynamics of change and development that he calls conversion: intellectual, moral, religious, and Christian. Here I must quote Father Lonergan directly to show his creative dissatisfaction with himself. At the end of the 780-page journey in Insight, there is written in 1957 the following: after spending years reaching up to the mind of Aquinas, I came to a twofold conclusion. On the one hand, that reaching has changed me profoundly. On the other hand, that change was the essential benefit. On the further aspects of that reaching and change, I seek to say nothing, since even the human word can sometimes be engendered by an attentive silence, and ask instead Father Lonergan to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Wesolowski. Aquinas today, Tradition and Innovation. From the year 1879, when Pope Leo XIII issued his encyclical Aeterni Patris, up to the Second Vatican Council, the influence of St. Thomas Aquinas was dominant in Roman Catholic schools of philosophy and theology. Since the beginning of the Council, Aquinas has abruptly gone out of fashion. Particularly in the period from 1920 to 1940, studies of his writings and of his thought poured forth in books and articles. Since the Council, what had been a torrent has become a trickle. No doubt the intervention of church authorities had not a little to do with the former dominance of Thomism. Again, no doubt, enthusiasm for medieval thought was discouraged, both by Pope John's watchword, aggiornamento, and by the tendency in conciliar debates to use the word scholastic as a term of reproach. But if one wishes to enter into the theological issues involved, one must turn one's thoughts, I suggest, to the ongoing interplay in human history of tradition and innovation. The innovations I envisage are the successive large-scale developments in medieval and modern culture. They are specializations in theology, in philosophy, in science, in scholarship. They have occurred at different times. Each was prepared by earlier stages, in which their later separate tasks were undifferentiated parts in previous larger wholes. In each case, their emergence generated identity crises in their former hosts and demanded the discovery and development of new methods and procedures. In this process extending over centuries, Aquinas was a great representative of the medieval theological tradition of Lectio and Quaestio, of the reading that expanded into commentaries, and of the questioning that grew into elaborate summas. But he also was a great innovator, winning for Aristotle a place of esteem within theological inquiry and a recognition for usefulness. Moreover, he carried through a distinction between natural and supernatural, and by it he prepared the way for the independent study of nature, for a philosophy that was not just a tool for theology, for a science that against Aristotle vindicated its own autonomy, for a scholarship that took the history of religion out of the competence of theologians to hand it over to scholars. When I venture to speak to you on Aquinas today, it is to explore the ongoing relevance of Aquinas through these subsequent transformations of Western culture, and to leave you with the question whether the current lull in Thomist studies portends the end of Thomism, or is perhaps just a pause for reflection, a Toynbean withdrawal, preparing a new and more effective return. My discussion falls into four parts. First, specializations. Outlines different types of transformation a learned tradition may undergo. Secondly, Aristotle today notes post-medieval limitations on Aristotle's acceptability. Thirdly, Aristotle in Aquinas inspects Aquinas' involvement in these limitations. Fourthly and finally, there is found as a remainder Aquinas today. So specializations, Aristotle today, Aristotle in Aquinas, and Aquinas today. First, specialization. I have been using the word specialization in one of its less usual meanings. Most commonly, it is thought to be a concentration on one field to the neglect of all others, of an increasing contraction of attention in that one field, so that, as people say, one comes to know more and more about less and less. But what I have in mind is something at once more general and more radical. It is more general, for it lumps the sciences together in a single category to contrast them with other fields of human activity. It is more radical, for it results in a differentiation of outlook, mentality, horizon. It sets up barriers to mutual communication. It has people living, so to speak, in different worlds. An account of this type or aspect of specialization comes in two parts. There is a generic part that outlines the notion and implications of horizon. There is a specific part that emerges when specialization passes a critical point and, as it were, ushers one into a new world. I shall speak of each of these in turn. Etymologically, horizon, horizon, kuklos, is what bounds or limits. The boundary or limit that concerns us here is a boundary to a person's interest and knowledge. What lies beyond that boundary he neither knows nor cares. What lies within it, to some extent he knows, and to some extent he cares. The boundary is a variable. It varies in extent as some individuals or groups are found to know more than others. It varies in intensity as interest grows or slackens. It varies in selectivity, as interest centers now in one area and now in another. Such variations in extent, intensity, selectivity help fill out what we mean by relevance. The relevant, in an absolute sense, is what is known, what is of interest, what may be selected for attention and consideration. Again, as horizons change, there occur shifts in what is known, what is of interest, what merits selection. And so histories come to be rewritten. Geniuses are pulled out of the shadows of the past into the light of day. And doctrines, once obscure and forgotten, take on a fresh luster and acquire a new vitality and power. In any individual, his actual horizon is the fruit of his past development. And his past development, in the main, is his participation in the earlier developments of others, and only on rare occasions the product of his own originality and creativity. Moreover, such development admits categorization to yield a differentiation of horizons. It may pertain to the pre-linguistic development, in which the infant is confined, to the common sense development of intelligence that specializes in the concrete and immediate, to the religious development that orientates man to God and in the universe, to the scientific development that unifies and relates, constructs and extrapolates, serializes and generalizes to discover and reveal the cosmos, to the scholarly development that enters into the common sense of another place and time to understand its language, interpret its meanings, narrate its deeds and achievements, to the philosophic development that, in what may now seem its final phase, reflects on all of these, assigns each its proper competence, and relates each to the others. In all of these spheres, development initially is grafted upon natural endowment or previous attainment, and there it functions in a symbiosis so intimate and so complete that distinction seems superfluous and even arbitrary. But as advance continues in collaborating groups and cumulative achievement, there begin to emerge in each sphere its proper procedures. On distinct procedures follow characteristic products, varying styles of growth and inner organization, functional separateness and disparate goals. Earlier, the distinction of one sphere from another seemed fanciful. Later, it has become a manifest fact, and the thought of any overall synthesis appears no more than a nostalgic dream. I am urging then a source of radical cultural differences, not to be identified simply with the diversity of traditions, the varieties of religious experience, the proliferation of languages, the conflicts of philosophies. It is a differentiation that is concealed in its early stages by its symbiosis with preceding achievement, and this concealment is permanent in the minds of those that have advanced no further. But the same differentiation for those that reach its later stages is all the more striking and strange, for the new enterprise detaches itself from its original host and proceeds in the main to expand and to function on its own. Let me illustrate the matter, for it is very much to our purpose. Infants, infantes, are those that do not speak, and Jean Piaget has observed and recorded the development of his own 3 children during the first 24 months of their lives. It is a cumulative process that may be recalled by mentioning the key notions of assimilation and adjustment, combination and group. It revealed that if the human infant acquired slowly and laboriously what came spontaneously or at least rapidly to the kitten or puppy or cub, still the great advantage was on the side of the infant. The infant was slow because of its enormously greater plasticity, and it took longer because it learnt immeasurably more. Among other things, the infant learned to speak, to match speech with action, to place an organism at the beck and call of meanings and values mediated by conventional signs. In the first instance, such meanings and values are the fruits of the basic and homeliest developments of intelligence, common sense. As a procedure, a mode of development, it is common to mankind, but as a content, it is endlessly diversified. Each village grows its own variety to mold the local ordinary language, to make a man from the next village a stranger because his speech and his ways are different, and a man from another country not merely strange but foreign. Finally, however much the mastery of language begins in infancy, nonetheless, so far apart are the earlier development of the infant and the later common sense embedded in ordinary language, that a neurotic's departures from common sense can be described as infantile regression. The proliferation of languages is also a proliferation of thought forms and traditions of languages and histories. In this fashion, there is constituted the field to be explored by scholarship. Basically, the scholar is the man that adds to his native common sense some mastery of the common sense of other places and times. He is the linguist that translates, the exegete that interprets, the historian that reconstructs and narrates. Such basic scholarship, however, can be enlisted in the service of quite different goals. There is the classical scholarship that promotes the aims of a particular culture and provides the proper instrument for the education and acculturation of its young. There is the quite different modern scholarship, universalist in outlook, affine to science in its aims, esoteric in its achievement of a group of professional specialists. Such a group was foreshadowed by the Moorists in France and by the Bollandists in the Low Countries. It was realized by the university seminars emulating the example set by Leopold von Ranke in Berlin. There has been built up an ongoing cumulative tradition that developed new skills and techniques. New standards have been set, and competence to meet these standards is to be acquired only by serving a long and exacting apprenticeship. The outcome is specialization. Exegetical and historical works have ceased to be composed principally for the general public. Their primary audience has become an in-group of professors and graduate students. From being the servant of a particular, though multinational culture, scholarship has become a distinct, self-sufficient, autonomous specialty. A parallel result is followed on specialization in the sciences, and there it admits a more precise contrast. Eddington's two tables have become symbolic. There is the table apprehended by common sense. It is continuous, solid, heavy, with its own distinctive color, dimensions, contours. But the same table as envisaged by science is mostly empty space with here and there, though without exactly determinable position and momentum, what now is a wave and now a particle. What holds for the table holds for everything else. A few centuries ago, scientific discovery could be communicated to the whole educated public, and there be understood and discussed competently. But now there are two worlds. A different technical language is needed to speak of the scientist's world. Only a new and distinct social group masters that language. Specialist journals report to the initiated new advances and discoveries. Specialist books are written to set forth their achievements and their aims. Specialist methods are developed to reach their distinctive goals, and specialist criteria are employed to test their success. Science is the clear-cut paradigm of specialization. It offers its own distinct apprehension of the cosmos. That apprehension can be reached only through distinctive methods and techniques. It can be communicated only through a specially evolved language. It can be shared only by an ongoing collaborating group of initiates. Still, parallel characteristics are to be noted in each of the endless varieties of common sense and of common sense's ordinary languages. They reappear in a new form when one contrasts the expertise of the scholar in his chosen field and his quite different skill, or perhaps his surprising gaucherie in his everyday affairs. A completely new dimension is revealed when one departs from the observable religions of mankind and seeks to trace the path of the mystics into that region of which one is told, those that speak do not know, and those that know do not speak. There remain the philosophers, a group apart if ever there was one, yet seemingly unsure of their function. Some identify their cause with that of common sense or ordinary language. Others assume the role of spokesman for science. Still others switch their reflective concern on the hermeneutics of existence and the originality of Geschichte. Greeks of old sought to be universalist and autonomous by discoursing on being. A few moderns take their cue from the differentiation of horizons by specialization, and through an appeal to authentic subjectivity, seek to distinguish and evaluate the various orientations of the polymorphic consciousness of man. So much for specializations, what is meant by it. Secondly, Aristotle today in science and very briefly on scholarship. Thought that was quite brilliant and investigation that was quite thorough in the 4th century Athens today easily enough is out of date. The generic reason lies in the transforming specializations we have just considered. But there has to be added a more specific concern with science, with scholarship, and by repercussion with that chameleon, philosophy. There is no doubt that the knowledge available to modern scientists extends way beyond Aristotelian anticipations. But more important than the mere extent of scientific knowledge is the underlying conception of science itself. For it is change in the very notion of science that accounts not only for the new abundance of information, but on a deeper level, for the repercussion of scientific development on the notion and function of philosophy. For Aristotle, the sciences were not autonomous disciplines. Together with philosophy, they formed a single block, a viewpoint still extant when Newton entitled his masterpiece Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. It was on mechanics. The sciences were distinguished from philosophy by Aristotle in the same manner as they were distinguished from one another, by their objects, and indeed by their objects as they happened to be conceived. Moreover, since the object of metaphysics was the most general and fundamental of all, being is being, it followed that the principles of metaphysics held for all objects, and that the basic terms of metaphysics supplied the core element in the basic terms of the sciences. Against this crippling negation of autonomy, the modern sciences struggled for centuries. Herbert Butterfield, The Origins of Modern Science, is a brief but helpful outline. The first complaint was that science had to be concerned not with words but with things. It had some justification. It is true that in the posterior analytics, Aristotle's premise in that is that scientific knowledge is about things. It is knowledge of the cause, knowledge that it is the cause, knowledge that the effect cannot be other than it is. It remains that this premise is just a springboard. From scientific knowledge, Aristotle proceeded at once to scientific syllogism, and to his theory of science as argument or proof of a special kind, he devoted the substance of the work. So scientific knowledge comes to be conceived as a matter of essential predication, and this conception is embedded in a linguistic matrix in which syllogisms work through middle terms, categories are semantically elementary predicates, and substances are the first subjects of predicates. There is, in fact, quite a linguistic turn to Aristotelian thought. A second point in the anti-Aristotelian campaign, the first was things, not words. The second regarded controls. In the Aristotelian organon, categories were listed. Valid reasoning was explored. Its scientific variant was expounded. Topics were treated abundantly. Interpretation was outlined. Fallacies were exposed. Refining on this achievement, the scholastics introduced the formal disputation, in which assertions were to be proved syllogistically, objections were presented against the major premise of the minor, and answers commonly came in the form of distinctions. Distinctions acquired a bad name. They enabled the disputant to add his afterthoughts, and while such thoughts could be brilliant, they also could be the convenient inventions of the moment over which there was no effective control. To close such doors to uncontrolled speculation, the Royal Society in England had a rule. Questions were not considered unless they could be settled by an appeal to observation or experiment. Science was to be not just science, but empirical science. The stand against verbalism and the exigence for empirical controls gradually brought about three effects. First was a shift from an excessively rigorous to a practically attainable ideal of science. Secondly, there was dropped Aristotle's concern with essences and essential predicates, and in their place came empirically grounded conceptual systems. Thirdly, the sciences were divided not by material and formal objects, but by fields and methods. On each of these three, a few words must be said. First, Aristotelian science was to be causal, necessary, true. Modern science still speaks of causes, but it does not think of end, agent, matter, form. It thinks of correlation or concomitance. Again, up to this century, scientists spoke of the necessary laws of nature and even of the iron laws of economics. But the reflections of logicians, the discoveries of mathematicians, the relegation of Newtonian mechanics to a limiting case, and Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle have made necessity in science a marginal notion. The laws of empirical science are not statements of what could not be other than it is. They merely state what could be the case and in fact happens to be so. By the requirement and criterion of verifiability, empirical science reveals its object to be not necessity, but verifiable possibility. Finally, Aristotelian science wanted to be a Thucydidean possession for all time. Science had to be true. But modern science claims no more for its positive achievements than probability. The ideal has ceased to be definitive achievement. It has become ongoing advance. The second consequence was a shift from essences to systems. In the posterior analytic, scientific knowledge was conceived in terms of scientific syllogisms. In such syllogisms, the predicate pertained to the subject universally, necessarily, eternally. But the modern shift from concepts and words to things is also a shift from the predicates of subjects to empirically established laws. Such laws are links, connections, relations. Of their nature, they imply terms that are linked, connected, related. Such terms may be conceived materially or formally. Conceived materially, they denote, at least in part, what could be known apart from the law. But conceived formally, they denote simply and solely what is implied by the law. For example, Newton conceived mass as quantity of matter, and both quantity and matter had long been conceived independently of empirically established laws. But from the later viewpoint of the hypothetico-deductive system, one thinks of mass simply as m, that is, as the factor that recurs in a number of mechanical laws. When all the basic terms of mechanics are conceived in this fashion, there results a system, that is, a closed circle of basic terms and relations, where the terms fix the relations fix the terms, while both terms and relations are fixed by empirically established laws. The third consequence secured the autonomy of the sciences. As long as they were divided in terms of material and formal objects, they formed a single block under philosophic hegemony. The material objects were the subjects of essential predicates. The formal objects were the essential predicates on which scientific conclusions could rest. The material objects could be arranged in a hierarchy in accord with their generality, and thereby what was accepted in the more general science would automatically be transferable to the less general. This could cause no harm, for the more general contained all the truth and nothing but the truth. But where such perfection was lacking, issues would be clouded, originality stifled, growth obstructed. Against such interference from argument came the appeal to observation and experiment, and by that recurrent appeal, the constitution of distinct sciences became the result of a distinction, not of material and formal objects, but of fields and methods. In a contemporary estimate of the Aristotelian corpus, there are to be noted not only a very notable divergence of the modern from the ancient notion of science, but also the emergence in very recent centuries of a new scholarship. Its ideal has been the interpretative reconstruction of the constructions of mankind. Its ramifications and extent can be indicated only by the German name, Geisteswissenschaften, which William Dilthey succeeded in distinguishing radically from the Naturwissenschaften. Its reality is witnessed by the whole range of cultural studies, and for theologians, by the enormous bibliographies that confront them in the fields of biblical, patristic, medieval, and modern erudition. Its analysis has not yet reached commonly accepted results. In my opinion, the key element is the acquisition of the common sense of another place and time, and the closest Aristotelian equivalent to common sense is phronesis, the practical wisdom which Aquinas examined at considerable length in his Summa Theologiae. Secunda Secundae, questions 48 to 56. So much for Aristotle today in science and scholarship, the changes in the notions of science, and the introduction of a totally unknown notion of scholarship. There's another point on Aristotle today, namely philosophy. Our investigation now enters upon a more complex and delicate phase. The role of philosophy in Thomist theology traditionally has been conceived as that of a handmaid to a queen. Essential to that role is the ability of philosophy to mediate between theology and its auxiliary disciplines. But it is precisely this mediating role that is impugned when a philosophy is attacked and attacked successfully because it has denied the sciences their autonomy. Accordingly, a notable and serious modification of Aristotelian philosophy seems needed if it is to continue to fulfill this mediating function in a contemporary Thomism. It remains that a notable modification is one thing and a total rejection is quite another. In the history of thought, there is no lack of examples of a later position going quite beyond without completely rejecting its predecessor. In arithmetic, there is a transition from Roman to Arabic numerals and then from decimal to binary notation. In geometry, the transition from Euclid's unformulated assumption to a contemporary exact formulation. In physics, the transitions from Newton's mechanics to Einstein's relativity and from Maxwell's electromagnetics to Heisenberg's indeterminacy. Finally, in philosophy, there is the whole category of advances that Hegel named sublation, Aufhebung. No doubt these instances are disparate, but they do illustrate two important points. First, totally unanticipated later developments can go quite beyond earlier attainment and yet maintain the continuity that is the secret of a tradition that admits innovation. Secondly, such an advance, when explicit and deliberate, in no way necessitates confusion between earlier and later context and procedures. The transition we envisage is from logic to method. Aristotle himself would not admit the strict application of his own posterior analytics outside the field of mathematics. Modern science places its reliance not on any principles or laws it has discovered and may revise, but upon an empirical method. Modern scholarship operates on similar lines in its very different field. It is a matter of growing familiarity with the data, advancing comprehension of their meaning and significance, and complete submission to the demand for revision when contrary data or a fuller comprehension come to light. My own study, Verbum, a word and idea in Aquinas, would show the continuity of such ideas of method with the Aristotelian and Thomist tradition, while my larger work, Insight, sets forth the generalized empirical method that operates principally on the data of consciousness to work a cognitional theory, an epistemology, and a metaphysics.
A shift from logic to method.
The key place goes to the self-appropriation of the subject, to his discovery and acknowledgement of human authenticity and unauthenticity, to his option for authenticity, and thereby for a philosophic foundation, less showy, but far more effective than an appeal to demonstrations. There follows the replacement of a faculty psychology by an intentionality analysis. Finally, as intentionality analysis distinguishes successive levels of conscious operations by the type of question they answer, as it has questions for intelligence, what, why, how, what for, precede questions for reflection, is that so, are you certain? And both precede questions for deliberation, is it good, is it truly good? So also it acknowledges the sublation of the earlier by the later. By sublation, the later goes beyond the earlier, sets up a higher objective, introduces new operations, but so far from setting aside or interfering with the earlier, preserves them in their integrity, refines their performance, extends their relevance, enriches their significance. On this showing, speculative intellect loses its primacy. The key position now pertains to the deliberating subject, and his deliberations are existential, for they determine what he is to be. They are interpersonal, for they determine his relations with others. They are practical, for they make this earth a better or a worse place in which we are to live. I have been describing a shift in priorities, and I must add that it does not of itself imply a change in content. The shift from abstract premises to concrete subjects is not privation but enrichment. A basis in cognitional theory is not a negation of metaphysics, but the establishment of a critically structured metaphysics. To replace faculty psychology by intentionality analysis is to set aside a jejune and ambiguous scheme in favor of a wealth of ordered fact. To deprive speculative intellect of its pride of place and to acknowledge the primacy of conscience is not only a recognition of fact, but also quietens the opponents of intellectualism without diminishing the power of intellect. Further, the shift from logic to method includes an acknowledgement of the autonomy of science and of scholarship. But the autonomy recognized is under the control of a method. Such controlled autonomy ensures both openness to current views and alertness to spot needed revisions. It grounds sharp distinctions between the results of scientific work and the extra-scientific opinions of scientists, between scholarly conclusions and non-scholarly pronouncements. If it permits modern science and scholarship to correct what in the Aristotelian corpus might be mistaken for philosophy, it thereby puts on a rational basis what otherwise tended to be initially the haphazard result of a long-sustained war of attrition, but later the wholesale desertion of a venerable and still valuable tradition. Finally, there is an important difference between method in the sciences and method in philosophy. Empirical method leaves the sciences open to radical revision because its appeal is to the data of sense, but its basic terms and relations denote not the data of sense, but constructs derived from empirically established laws. In contrast, the basic terms and relations of an empirically established cognitional theory are not just constructs, but also data of immediate consciousness. Its basic terms denote conscious events. Its basic relations denote stages in conscious process. Hence, to introduce new basic terms and new basic relations, and thereby establish a radical revision, would be not merely the revision of a theory, but the creation of a new type of consciousness. So much for Aristotle today in science, scholarship, and philosophy. Aristotle in Aquinas. To what extent was Aquinas involved in the things that are no longer acceptable in Aristotle? My title was Aquinas Today, but so far I've been speaking of Aristotle today. I've been stressing not his excellence, but his effect. In his posterior analytics, he conceived scientific knowledge in terms of scientific syllogism, and I have been urging that contemporary science, contemporary scholarship, and at least one contemporary philosophy would counsel a shift from logic to method. I must now add 5 observations. 3 of them are theoretical, 2 of them are factual, but the 5 together will help us make the turn from Aristotle today to Aristotle in Aquinas. The first of the theoretical observations is that method, so far from excluding logic, includes it. It adds to logic such non-logical operations as observing, describing, comparing, stumbling on problems, discovering solutions, devising tests, checking results. But integral to such non-logical operations there are, within method itself, the properly logical operations of defining terms, formulating hypotheses, working out presuppositions, and inferring conclusions. The second of the theoretical observations is that inferences can be explanatory without their premises being necessarily true. 14th century theologians were very accurate logicians, and they rightly contended that what necessarily is true would be true in every possible world. But modern scientists are content with explanations that hold in this world. Indeed, they are content to claim that the explanations they offer are the best available at the present time. The third of the theoretical observations is that sustained advance, ongoing development, continued progress, is not a matter of deducing conclusions that follow necessarily from premises that are both true and necessary. In that case, results are certain and enduring, but they are reached in a single leap, and once they are reached, the life of mind settles down into a routine. Sustained advance is a succession of fresh insights, of increasingly accurate hypotheses, of the emergence of quite new theories, of an ever greater command of data in precision, in variety and extent, and of a constant openness to still further ideas. Needless to say, such sustained advance is not the work of one person. It is not the work of several persons, each working independently and in isolation from the others. It is the work of specialization bringing to birth its own distinct apprehension of the cosmos. That apprehension can be reached only through distinctive methods and techniques. It can be communicated only through a specially evolved language. It can be shared only by an ongoing collaborating group of initiates who preserve what has been achieved by the continuity of a tradition and keep it alive by the tension of that their innovations create. On three theoretical, there follow two factual observations. The first is that Aristotle, in his own writings, left necessary premises and conclusions to the mathematicians. His own rule was to seek in each subject no greater exactitude than the matter permitted. In his eyes, it was just as silly to ask a politician for demonstrations as to accept plausible reasons from a mathematician. Our second factual observation is very brief. It is that the theology of Aquinas was not more influenced by the posterior analytics than was the philosophy of Aristotle. It is true that Aquinas quoted the analytics much more than Aristotle did, but it also is true that he was not thereby caught in the implications of that work. For the implications depend upon essential predication, and Aquinas consistently denied that we knew either the essence of God or the substance of material objects. And his denial didn't mean that he didn't do any theology at all. He did 20 volumes of it. But in the 14th century, that influence of Aristotle led first of all to skepticism and then to sterility. The fact is that Aquinas regarded himself not as a philosopher or as a scientist, but as a teacher. He was forever exemplifying the first sentence of the posterior analytics, that all teaching and learning rests on previously acquired knowledge. In the Contra Gentiles, he set forth his objective as the communication of Christian truth. Such truth he divided into two sections: truth that was both professed by faith and concluded by reason, and that he would present with the demonstrative or probable reasons he had found in the books of philosophers and saints, not only with the demonstrative reasons, but the demonstrative or the probable. He was a teacher, but there was further truth that exceeded the reach of human reason. Arguments against it he would refute, but for it he could adduce only probable reasons and the testimony of authorities. Again, the prologue to his Summa Theologiae explains that it was written for beginners who found in existing writings more a hindrance than a help. Either such writings needlessly multiplied questions, headings, arguments, or they followed the order of books that they were commenting and neglected the order in which things can be taught, or their frequent repetitions both confused and wearied students. Accordingly, he proposed to present Christian teaching as briefly and clearly as the matter permitted. If we bear in mind that Aquinas was a teacher, we also must remember that he taught in the medieval period, when theology became a specialty. Then first there arose a collaborative, ongoing, cumulative process of reflection and formulation that topically ordered and explanatory developed the Christian tradition as a whole. Its inspiration was the search of faith for understanding, and in this effort, Anselm of Canterbury was a pioneer. In contrast, its implementation was a spontaneous growth. The traditional combination of lectio and quaestio, of reading that learnt from the past and of questioning that assimilated what it read, gave rise to a two-pronged advance. On the side of reading was the succession from glossaries to commentaries, and from catene to such ordered catalogues of traditional views as Peter Lambert's 4 books of sentences. On the side of questioning, there emerged a technique that collected the incoherences real or apparent in traditional views and worked methodically towards their reconciliation. The juxtaposition and commonly the fusion of these two developments had the double effect of bringing tradition to life by the questioning and of making questioning significant by basing it on traditional materials. Now, the teaching career of Aquinas began a century and a half after the death of Anselm and a century after the death of Peter Lambert. Of the intellectual vigor and academic diligence of the intervening period, I can offer only soundings. Anselm may perhaps be regarded as brilliant as Aquinas. Both of them, both Anselm and Aquinas, wrote on the intricate relations of grace and free choice. But Anselm's work seems no more than a well-intentioned exercise in logic when compared with the wide information and the theoretical mastery exhibited by Aquinas. Nor was this theoretical mastery, as romantics might imagine, just the product of Aquinas' genius. Arthur Landgraf studied at length the work of Aquinas' predecessors on grace, and Don Latin has studied their thought on human liberty. And without these previous developments, Aquinas would not have had even the categories in which he expressed his thought. Aquinas then was not simply an innovator. He carried on the work begun by his predecessors. He did so within the academic framework they had developed. As they commented on the religious and philosophic heirlooms of tradition, so did he. As they solved series of questions, so did he. As they included Aristotle among their authorities, so did he. Yet it was just this seemingly incidental use of Aristotle that provided the vehicle for his perhaps greatest innovation. For he quoted Aristotle from a mastery of the text, from a penetration of its grounds and implications, from a grasp of its significance for teaching Christian truth in his day. That significance was threefold. First, there was the need for a coherent theological Begrifflichkeit, conceptuality, is sometimes used as a translation of that German word. Just as diverse statements in the Christian tradition needed to be reconciled, so too the many reconciliations devised by theologians needed the overall reconciliation that was to be obtained only by underpinning theological invention by a comprehensive system of thought. Secondly, there was a need for a unified apprehension of things. The search of faith for understanding could not be merely partial understanding. It had to be coupled with an understanding of nature, else divine grace would be perfecting an unknown nature, and divine faith would be illuminating an unknown reason. Thirdly, there was the problem of the University of Paris. There had been translated the brilliant studies of Aristotle by Arabic thinkers. There had emerged Parisian Averroists. There had to be performed an apologetic task if an alien faith was not to obtain by its books a hegemony that it had failed to obtain by its arms. Finally, Aquinas today. Though a singularly traditional thinker, Aquinas was also a great innovator. Other Christians before him had used the writings of philosophers in their theological work. But as the medieval period was the first in which theology became a full-fledged specialization, in the very strong sense in which I've been using the term, so Aquinas was the first to think through a theology with philosophic aid. How novel his procedure was may be estimated from the virulence of the controversy between Augustinians and Aristotelians that followed his death. But how sound was his innovation is confirmed by the lasting esteem in which subsequently he has been held. I began by mentioning that today there is a lull in Thomist thinking and writing, and part at least of the reason would seem to lie in the specializations that have arisen since the days not only of Aristotle but also of Aquinas himself. But it remains that the motives Aquinas had in baptizing Aristotle are no less operative today than in the Middle Ages. As then, so today, there can be needed an apologetic clarification of issues. As then, so today, systematic thinking in theology stands in need of a broad and coherent basis. As then, so today, an account of man's salvation cannot get along without an adequate understanding of man himself. As Father Claude Geoffrey of the Order of Preachers has made the point at some length, we are living in a new age of theology, a nouvel âge de la théologie. Paris, Certes, 1972. Whether or not this new age is to be thought discontinuous with its past will depend, I believe, on one's understanding both of the past and of the present. In any case, my own studies have led me to expect a rather notable continuity. While I cannot on the present occasion justify this opinion, I do feel bound to indicate a few illustrations of what I have in mind. First, there is the continuity from the implicit to the explicit. I have argued explicitly for a method in theology, but the medieval specialization was implicitly methodical, and this is pre-Aristotelian. The cataloging and ordering of data from the past in books of sentences, and the use of the technique of quaestio to clarify, to reconcile all the various things that were put forward. The medieval specialization was implicitly methodical. Its commentaries and books of sentences sought to do what today is achieved in research, interpretation, and history. Its questions and summas did the work now carried on in dogmatics and systematics. Then as now, theology operated methodically, but method now is talked about, and then it was not. Secondly, there is continuity in the shift from the Aristotelian ideal of science to the modern reality, for it involves a change more in structure than in content. Where before the metaphysical was primary, now the existential is primary. Where Aristotle spoke of forms, we can experience insights. Where he transposed from Augustinian veritas to his own essay, we can advert with Newman to the unconditional character of assent. Where he discoursed at length on virtues as operative habits, we can think with the Greeks of arete as excellence and develop the moral feelings that promote it. where he conceived the grace of justification as a supernatural habit, we can note his doctrine that grace makes us choose what is right, where before we chose what was wrong, and so can give it the more familiar name of conversion. For him, theology was not only science, but something better, wisdom. And this we can retain in terms of the successive sublations observed in intentionality analysis, where the curiosity of sense is taken over by the inquiry of intelligence, where inquiry is taken over by rational reflection, where reflection prepares the way for responsible deliberation, where all are sublimated by being in love with one's family, in love with the human community, in love with God and his universe. Thirdly, there is continuity by analogy. The world of Aquinas was very different from our own. His was a world of Babylonian and Ptolemaic ancestry, with this earth at its center, with its fixed species sustained by the benign influence of the heavenly spheres, with its short history of less than 10,000 years. How completely and intimately the thought of Aquinas was embedded in that world barely appears in summary accounts of his doctrine or in selected readings recommended to students. But it is a matter of manifest importance once one begins to read him extensively, to compare successive phases in his thought, to penetrate to the fine texture of his development. For us, his world was static and our own is dynamic. It is a world in process. Its age is in numbers we do not comprehend. Its story is a slow interplay of classical and statistical laws, the formation of galaxies and nebulae, of suns and planetary systems, the emergence of elements and compounds, the slow ascent of countless species of living things, and their ecosystems. But if scientific specialization differentiates our world from that of Aquinas, theology changes difference into analogy. As Aquinas conceived his world as coming from God and returning to God, so too can we. As Aquinas conceived man as the end of the material universe, so much more clearly and distinctly can we. Finally, as Aquinas, so we too can place the meaning and significance of the visible universe as bringing to birth the elect, the recipients to whom God gives himself in love, in the threefold giving that is the gift of the Holy Spirit to those that love, Romans 5:5, the gift of the divine word made flesh and dwelling amongst us, John 1:14, the final gift of union with the Father who is originating love, 1 John 4:8-16. I thank you.
Short question or discussion period. I would leave it up to you, Father.
Well, any questions? Perhaps we better let escape those that don't want to ask questions, and those that want to ask questions can remain.
Fine. If those who would want to remain.
Father Lonergan, may I ask you this question? We were just discussing it among ourselves during this break. Now, if I understood the main thrust of your lecture, it was to point out something very important in the background that led to the relative discontinuity, so to say, of the authority of Aquinas. Now, the main point seems to be in the new kind of knowledge that arises with modern science. Is there at the same time the second element or trend in your very rich in content lecture that would point out toward the end this kind of similarity of the basic situation or condition in which we are with the condition, with the situation explored by Aquinas? And is it correct that what you point out is the possibility of this revival? Would that be proper reading of your lecture?
Yes, but you have to take revival in the sense of an analogy, not simply repeating. That's no longer possible. The development of modern science is not merely more science. It's all that science is. But it's a new conditional fact wasn't available for people thinking about knowledge before science existed. That particular type of science. The development of modern scholarship is exactly the same sort of thing, in another style. It's a new cognitional fact that didn't exist before. Wilhelm Dilthey, his first big project, was a critique of historical reason. He wanted to use the German historians, von Ranke and the historical school, the same way that Kant had used Newton. As Kant used Newton to set up a philosophic analysis. And he could do so because Newton was strictly scientific, although we call it philosophy. Dilthey wanted to use von Ranke and the German historian school, the Romantic school, and so on, as another example, new example of knowledge, to set up a further account, namely human knowledge or knowledge in the human sciences, what he called the Geisteswissenschaft. And he had to give up the project because while Ranke and so on were full of talk about the strict objectivity and so on of their investigation, still their ideas were full of ideas from the Enlightenment and from Hegel, despite their opposition to Hegel. And they didn't provide a pure instance of science the way Newton had provided. But what I want to say there is there are new facts of knowledge constituted by modern advance. And they have to be taken into account in a contemporary theology. And that is not only that, but they have to be taken into account by a philosophy, a contemporary philosophy. You can't simply resurrect Thomist philosophy or Aristotelian philosophy, because there are new facts that have to be taken into account. And in a new way, because new ideas on knowledge. And it's that set that provides the question, first the point. Aristotle today, what do we have to drop? What do you have to add? Aristotle in Aquinas. How much is Aquinas involved in these limitations of Aristotle, and how much of it was a genuine scientific procedure? In other words, there were the beginnings of modern science, empirical science, in the Middle Ages. It just didn't start after the Middle Ages were over. It started in the Middle Ages, and they had genuine science of an empirical type, with all its limitations and involvement in Aristotle and the rest of it. But the thing was there. And the same thing you have in theology. You have a genuine theological method going on that was not derived from Aristotle and was not dependent on Aristotle, and resembles what a theological method at the present time would be. There are elements then. Again, the limitations in Aristotle have a common root in his posterior analytics, an attempt to give a technical account of what science is. Really what Aristotle and Plato were doing was doing an overselling of the notion of science. It was what had been done by the astronomers and what had been done by the medical people and what had been done by the geometers and so on. And they were out to sell this to good people of common sense and ethics. And they oversold it when they talk about the eternity and necessity, all the rest of it. And modern science forces one to correct that and reorganize their conception of the relation between philosophy and science. And how can you put it in a nutshell what we have to do in theology? We have to effect a transition from logic to method as the basic idea. Not that you drop logic, but logic ceases to be the whole show, as it is in the posterior analytic. In the posterior analytic, you have a conception of science in terms of things. But 5 lines later, Aristotle's on to his notion of scientific syllogism. And the rest of it is scientific syllogism. Yeah.
In that, the classical definition of theology as fides quaerens intellectum, you have that definition fits very well, where your theory places the primacy to speculative intellect or logic. You have a faith, and then you try and work out its consequences logically. You try to work out its problems by solving them and so forth, by logic and by speculation. But now when you try and go about it in an empirical age, or with the advent of various other kinds of knowledge based on data, the prime question is then, which data are significant data and which are not? I could illustrate it easily enough in terms of a scripture scholar who might say the significant data are the history of Israel in the first millennium BC, then ask, is the history of the Liberal Party in Canada a significant datum? This is then, I suppose, the mystery of grace or the presence of the Spirit. But which data, or how does one go about deciding which data are relevant apart from one's own psyche?
Well, one starts from one's own tradition, one starts from where one is. You have nowhere else to start from.
Very good.
And everyone has to start from where he is.
But where you are
have
is
your
everywhere.
Your tradition. But before you're able to ask any questions, you've already been acculturated, socialized. That's there. And anything further you learn is going to be a transformation of that, a movement out of that. So that's where you start.
That is certainly true, but among the
you have this starting point, and if you move out of it, you can stay in it perhaps, but if you move out of it, what is authentic moving out of it? And that's transformation of horizon. And transformation of horizon is by attention to what's given. Understanding. Be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible, be in love. And those five, depend upon, are the conditions for the possibility of being an authentic human being. So, how do you get from where you are to where you should be? By being an authentic human being.
Now that's true, but you say you start from where you are, but in a sense, not in a sense. Very truly, you are everywhere. That is to say, you are at the center of a library, you are at the center of a huge communication réseau. You can decide to concentrate on the films which you've seen, you can decide to concentrate on the physics which you've read, you can decide to concentrate on economics which are being written now in Ottawa today, this evening. You are everywhere, and you can make your decision to start where you'd like.
In other words, you want an initial choice.
There must be a choice, yes, there must be.
You will have, either you have some idea of religion or you don't,
I see.
If you don't get into theology.
I see, okay.
That's an empirical approach,
Yes.
Yes?
Well, I'd like to ask you about philosophy of Thomas Aquinas rather than theology. It seems to me that he had a very distinct view of man, which was basically Aristotelian, divided man into a part which would disappear when you died and a part which would continue on, was not continued. And if you look at the modern view of man, which is largely conditioned by psychology, it assumes a mechanism, often a very impoverished sort of a mechanism, but basically a mechanism which is entirely deterministic and which leaves no room for things like free will and for the sort of generality and confidence in Thomas, a sentiment in Thomas. And the stance of a modern philosopher or a modern psychologist is that he will continue with this point of view until he's proven wrong. I don't think anything's going to be proven wrong. I mean, no empirical data are ever going to prove it wrong.
Well,
And so I don't see Thomas fitting in and making a great impact.
no, not Thomas. Now, you can't bring Thomas in the Middle Ages, and people today having any impact. That's true enough. No use putting Thomas on people. However, you can quote psychology. Abraham Maslow, now dead, died a few years ago. One time, president of the American Psychological Society, distinguished three-fourths of it. The third fourth, you have clinical psychology, experimental psychology, and the third fourth. He was in the third fourth. And he had a whole string of psychologists. And most people find that they make pretty good sense. They don't believe in the stick and carrot notion of human development. As Skinner, very sound empirical psychologist.